It's Environmental History Week this week, organized by the American Society for Environmental History. So I'm more than glad to welcome you all on this third ESEH seminar, Environmental History Today, a series of seminars on environmental history with people from all over the world presenting their environmental history research. My name is Tim Soens and I'm from the University of Antwerp in Belgium. And I'm honored to host this session on which will bring us to the Paramos in the north of Southern America, around Bogota, Colombia. We will have a presentation by Hanne Cottyn from the University of York, and Santiago Martínez and María Garrido from the Instituto Humboldt in Colombia. Afterwards, we will have a short comment by Paula Ungar, also from the Instituto Humboldt. And in the meanwhile, you can all post questions in the chat, or afterwards raise your hand. We will have an open discussion. This session is also recorded, and the recording will be posted on YouTube. We have a separate YouTube account, and I will distribute the link to the YouTube account afterwards. So I will now give the floor to Hanne, who will present herself and the team shortly, and then the research on the more than history, human history of the peasantisation of the páramos around Bogota. Hanne, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim Soens, and thank you to the European Society for Environmental History and also the American Society for Environmental History for this opportunity to present our research. So I'm a historian based at the University of York, and also here are Santiago Martínez and María Garrido. And together we've been. So what I'm going to present today are the first results of an ongoing research, Santiago, María, and myself, and research that is part of a broader interdisciplinary project that brings together humanities and social sciences with environmental sciences to integrate the ecological and cultural histories of the páramos of Colombia, particularly focusing on the páramos around Bogotá, to inform sustainable and equitable futures. And this brings me to a first very basic but important question: what are páramos? And before telling you anything more about it, I just want to start by sharing a short video. So let's see.
Soy el páramo. En lo alto de los Andes doy forma a la vida de un continente. Llevo aquí millones de años, haciendo algo sin lo cual no podrías vivir. Tengo un secreto que contarte. Escucha. Día tras día, un susurro acaricia mi piel y ocurre un milagro. Yo convierto las nubes en el mayor de los tesoros. Así, gota a gota, nacen los ríos. Soy donde comienza la creación, el final de toda sed. Y tú, los tuyos cada vez me quitan más, pero sabes, yo no me multiplico tan rápido. ¿Cuánto necesitas? La mayor riqueza es que yo pueda bajar el cielo y ponerlo entre tus manos. Sin mí, volverías a ser polvo. En cambio, yo Sin ti, simplemente florecería.
Okay, let me now go back to or start my presentation. So what we saw in the video is an absolutely stunning video by Conservation International about a landscape that has first been defined by Spanish colonizers as páramo, a term that they imported from the Iberian Peninsula to name the barren mountain areas that are situated above the tree line. And later in the 20th century, quite recently, this landscape became defined in terms of an ecosystem, and defined even in the 1990s by the Colombian state as a strategic ecosystem for its vital role in water regulation and carbon storage. The video takes us through a kind of imperial gaze over an empty landscape, exposing a páramo that is an abstract nature, separated from humans. Even more, the video ends by literally stating that nature does not need humans. Inspired by the notion of more than human histories and the call by anthropologist Anna Tsing and her colleagues for a different way of noticing landscape, our approach to the seemingly pristine landscape that we see presented in this video attends to science of landscape making. We may notice, for instance, the dominance of chusque plants, a kind of bamboo plant that hints at historical practices of burning the land to create pasture. We may notice abandoned campesino dwellings on land that was acquired by the Bogotá water company. We may notice frailejones, an iconic páramo plant, in places that used to be forest. We may notice also cows wandering around and murals with protest messages indicating how campesinos continue to inhabit the páramo as home. Anna Tsing and her colleagues define landscape making as a historical, ontological, and more than human process that is shaped by landscape simplifications. These landscape simplifications are state and market-driven attempts to reorganize the landscape and thereby multi-species interrelations into a controllable commodity-producing structure. And maybe the best example here is that of a plantation and how it concentrates and disciplines land and labor in function of extraction and exportation. But landscape making is also shaped by what these authors call feral effects or multi-species responses by humans, by non-humans, to these human designs, and ones that may counter and destabilize these landscape simplifications. And staying with the plantation, we may think about how this aspired control over human and non-human lives through monoculture, through slavery, is undermined as the plantation becomes an incubator of plant pathogens and of rebellion. And the result of this interplay between attempted simplifications and those responses is what these authors call a patchy Anthropocene. That is an Anthropocene or Capitalocene landscape that is profoundly but incompletely and unevenly simplified. Now, as remote and pristine as páramo landscape may seem, our argument is that they are equally the outcome of such landscape making processes. Combining historical and ethnographical methods, our research interrogates the multi-species entanglements that remain absent from the Conservation International video. In our research, we follow water infrastructures, bears, scientists, but in the paper that we present today, we particularly focus on the relation between páramo landscapes and campesinos or peasants, and how these campesinos have co-produced incomplete páramo simplifications. And we thereby build on important new efforts in rewriting peasant and páramo histories as intertwined histories. And I think here also about, amongst many others, initiatives, the hojas de ruta that are published by Paula Ungar, who will be our commentator, and Alejandra Osejo. And we try to, with our research, further nurture this dialogue or this need for dialogue. Now, since the late 19th century, market pressures, urbanization, and political wars pushed rural families high into the mountains around Bogotá. This fragment of a mural, a vast mural that is painted, that was painted some years ago in the premises of the Peasant Sindicato of Localidad 20 de Sumapaz, a rural district just south from Bogotá, depicts the history of how campesinas and campesinos arrived and organized their lives in the páramo. They developed an intimate, yet therefore not harmonious relationship with other páramo inhabitants, such as rivers, bears, or the frailejón plant that we see in the mural, and brought along other settlers, such as potatoes, that we see in the corner of this fragment. Following Tim Ingold's notion of a dwelling perspective, this process, we can understand this as a process of placemaking, of creating and protecting the páramo as their home, in collaboration always with non-human inhabitants of the páramo. But throughout the 20th century, this emerging entanglement became the object of changing state and market interests. State policies reflecting global developments and often elaborated in coordination with agricultural and environmental sciences sought to incorporate the páramo into the national economy, first through its cultivation and later through its conservation. And both processes came with contradictory implications for campesinos and are crucial to understand contemporary conservation conflicts in Colombia. We understand these developments as two attempted simplifications, one that sought to mold the páramo into a strategic farmland and a process that we label as peasantisation and that we trace back to the late 19th century, and one that seeks to mold the páramo into an ecosystem that produces drinking water for the capital, symbolically captured by the image of a water factory. And we label, quite experimentally, we label this, probably by the lack of a better word, as ecosystemization of the páramo. And we trace this process back to the 1930s. In this presentation, we focus on the partial overlap and the rising tensions between those two landscape simplifications during the 20th century, taking it into the 1980s. The three páramo areas in our research are located around Bogotá. And as this map indicates, where we see in the middle this yellow spot, the capital of Colombia, Bogotá, we see that all these three dark green spots that are the protected areas that include páramo land play a role in the water provision of Bogotá. Each is connected to the city through water reservoirs and pipes that were constructed first in the 1930s to the south in the páramo of Sumapaz Cruz Verde, in the 1940s, 50s to the north in Garrido, and in the east in Chingaza in the 1970s, 80s, the largest water infrastructure complex. But these páramos are also connected to each other in forming a kind of corridor around the city. However, they present very different social and environmental histories, which tend to be summarized a bit stereotypical today as Garrido being an extremely impacted páramo, a transformed, almost disappeared páramo, Chingaza as being a model protected area, and Sumapaz as being a politically powerful campesino territory stigmatized by decades of armed conflict. Now, if we start with this first trajectory of peasantization, while we can trace back the close relation between people and páramos, of course, back into pre-colonial times, and we observe significant reconfigurations from early colonial times on, it's particularly since the late 19th or second half of the late 19th century that this entanglement intensified and transformed. Until then, the páramos were only temporarily occupied. But in the context of the quina boom, livestock expansion, the promise of free land, and hacienda demands for cheap labor, as well as urban demands for food, for wood, and for coal, as well as political violence, rural families were pushed higher into the mountains around Bogotá, and the páramos were drawn into the rhythms of market and urban expansion, albeit marginally. Gradually, páramos were reorganized into a potato and cattle-producing landscape. This transformation starts in the bordering woodlands outside the páramo and was initiated by the opening of trochas, or trails, that unlock new reserves of land and labor, but was most powerfully driven by the process known as tumbar monte, which we could translate as bluntly flattening the mountain. And this was a collective process in which campesinos collaborated to remove high Andean woodland with machetes, followed by echar candela, or burning the land, in order to fertilize the soil and accelerate the growth of grassland. While fire has a long history in shaping the páramos, its potential to domesticate an agrarian landscape was taken to extremes, sparking imaginaries of a quote-unquote homogenizing bulldozer that was steered by colonizing peasants. However, it's a process of large-scale hacienda formation that constitutes an important driver in this domestication. Through the usurpation of baldío land or state lands and the purchase of resguardo lands, indigenous reservation areas, the páramos became ownership of large haciendas, which started to control most of the páramos around the páramo lands around Bogotá, with the most striking example probably of Hacienda Sumapaz, which started to comprise enormous extensions. Haciendas did not actively occupy páramo land, which they rather left to the initiative of their administrators, but they actively subjected their tenants to coerced labor mechanisms that are known as la obligación, and which ordered the tenants to quote-unquote clean and cultivate mountain lands. And in that way, hacienda control over cheap peasant labor was essential in industrializing this tumbar monte process. And as the systematic deforestation gave way to herbaceous plants, tumbar monte materialized in potrerización, or the pasteurization of the páramo, an anthropogenic phenomenon that modified páramo forest, the páramo forest limit in the mountains of Chingaza, Sumapaz, and Guerrero. From the 1930s on, this incipient process would start to accelerate in a context of increasing demographic pressures, leading to property fragmentation and land conflicts, and moving campesino practices higher into above the disappearing forest line. In Chingaza, as more land was quote-unquote liberated through tumbar monte, it was distributed as private property among haciendas, but was managed as a commons, as what was known as comunes, to pasture cows collectively. Guerrero remained similarly dominated by fragmented haciendas, but there we see particularly potatoes taking over the páramo, or taking over this forest páramo limit. In Sumapaz, meanwhile, the initiative came rather in hands of independent colonists, or colonos. In the first decades of the century, this páramo presented a much more dynamic scenario and became a very complex battlefield between hacendados, tenants, and colonos, and from which a power agrarian movement would arise that successfully redistributed hacienda land among the colonists. In the following decades, the potential of páramo land to expand the agrarian frontier increasingly attracted the attention of scientists and state institutions. A concrete example is the experimental farm that was established in the 1950s in the páramo of Sumapaz Cruz Verde, and which, quote, aimed at the economic incorporation of the páramos of Colombia, end of quote. The project proposed to, quote unquote, recover the páramo by manipulating the forest páramo limit through the introduction and acclimatization of new plant species, and even considered the introduction of llamas and alpacas from Peru. Even Ernesto Gould, considered the father of Colombian geography and would later advocate strongly for the protection of the páramos, stated in the 1960s, referring to the same páramo, that, quote, at the gates of Bogotá, to the south and to the east, there is a natural landscape to be conquered. This notion of a conquest, in the words of anthropologists Becerra and Pachón, who have researched this process in Guerrero, shows us how the páramos became laboratories of development, supported by a kind of can-do discourse that continued into the 1980s, forcefully displacing this idea that the páramos were barren mountain lands. The state's growing interest in simplifying páramo landscape into productive farmland meant that potrerización became a state policy. Páramo land became accessible through new roads, and particularly with the breakthrough of the Green Revolution after the 1950s, became increasingly more manageable thanks to important new machinery, essentially the tractor, the introduction of new species such as improved seeds and chemical inputs, which in the words of farmers at the time, enabled them to, quote, gave them the capacity to break the resistance of the páramo. This transformation was pursued and monitored by government and international cooperation agencies, the Credit Fund of Caja Agraria, and model farms, such as managed by the Instituto Colombiano Agropecuario. And oral histories recount how access to credit was made conditional to the adoption of agrochemicals and potrero conversion. The result was not only the rise of extensive cattle farming, and particularly in Guerrero, a very powerful potato frontier that was geared towards the commercialization of potato seedlings, but also a growing inequality between poor peasants that kind of fell out, couldn't cope with these required adoption of expensive agrochemicals, etc., and large-scale farmers that would start to rent their land to external actors. Now, borrowing the term from rural sociology and experimentally applying it to páramo landscapes, we understand this trajectory as a peasantization, not in the sense of just campesinos occupying the páramo, but as a state-subsidized hegemonic project to incorporate the páramo into the national economy. This peasantization generated a potrerization of the landscape, which essentially relied on campesino practices, such as tumbar monte, echar candela, but also on the extent in which the state was able to discipline and modernize those practices to create desirable productive subjects. And one of the peasant leaders of Sumapaz today refers to this process as the implantation of a chip that programmed them to produce regardless of the environmental impact. However, interestingly, he also refers to how campesinos have interfered in the course of this simplification, for instance, by limiting the expansion of the hacienda. Until the 1980s, the general tendency in Colombia was to increase in agricultural activities in the páramo. And the subsequent shift that we see in the rise of conservation policies resonates with what the work of Peluso and Van der Geest about the production of the political forest and how it's being replaced in the 21st century by a political conservation resonates a lot with the shift that we see in the páramos happening quite recently. However, this displacement is backed by the notion of an ecosystem, which is in itself a fairly recent concept, but is informed by a much larger trajectory through which the páramo became an object of scientific research, of engineering, and ultimately of conservation policies. It's a trajectory that interestingly overlaps and increasingly causes friction with the peasantization of the páramo. And it takes us back through the archives of the Empresa de Acueducto y Alcantarillado de Bogotá, the Bogotá Water Company, to the 1920s, when a commission was set up to design solutions for the city's increasing water needs. While páramos were deemed of little relevance initially for these plans because they were treeless landscapes, the rivers supplying Bogotá gradually lured, so to speak, the engineers into the páramos. And as an effect, the páramos became gradually part of urban water infrastructure. This came, of course, with implications for páramo people who saw their intimate relation to the páramo and their water sources first omitted in the company's designs and later actively exposed from those designs. Already in 1925, inhabitants in the higher parts of a river basin outside the city contested this approach of the company and noted that, quote, Bogotá has a very different idea of those of us who live in the páramo. We are well aware of the river basins inch by inch, and we offer with all our will our services for the sake of the purity of the waters and conservation of the woods and forests, end of quote. However, when engineers explored the Sumapaz Cruz Verde region, where they eventually would build the La Regadera reservoir, they concluded that the farmers of the páramo were distrustful and their lands were cheap, abandoned, or easily expropriated. This oblivion is even more remarkable in the case of Sumapaz, knowing that at the very same time in the 1930s, this region was rocked by powerful agrarian movements that apparently went unnoticed. As demographic pressures rose in these areas, the presence of campesinos was more explicitly acknowledged, but in terms of an obstacle. Local farms around the La Regadera Reservoir and the Neusa Reservoir in Garrido were purchased or expropriated, hunting and fishing was prohibited, and human and cattle movement was restricted, while other species were introduced, creating a kind of alpine landscape of pine trees, calm waters, and freshwater trout. One that we see probably best reflected at the Neusa Park, which we see in the picture, in kind of back in this idea of creating an ideal European kind of landscape that would also support water provision. Now, interestingly, these interventions, these infrastructures also came with both deliberate but also unexpected effects on the potential of the páramos, on the agrarian potential of the páramo that was at the same time explored. In the case of Neusa, the filling of the reservoir caused a temperature drop and obliged potato cultivation to retreat to lower altitudes, temporarily strengthening the process of migration and abandonment. In Sumapaz, the experimental farm that we mentioned earlier operated on the lands of the water company and came in with this proposal to combine making of the páramo productive in agricultural terms, making agriculture viable, while contributing to conservation of water sources through reforestation. And we could see that farm as a kind of tipping point, because in the following decades, we will see that the combination, this attempted combination of agriculture and water in the páramos was displaced by a conservation policy that defined agriculture as incompatible. In 1961, researchers of the Institute of Natural Resources stated that, quote, in order to satisfy the domestic fuel needs of a few peasant individuals, vegetation is being destroyed. And to sustain a minimum population of domestic animals of poor quality or to produce crops that only benefit their producers, and this in a deficient way, considerable extensions are being burned year after year with damage to the waters, to the fauna and flora, and to the direct detriment of the country and the landscape, and especially the capital city, end of quote. The campesino practices that were being disciplined in function of economic development became villainized. The researchers advocated for the creation of a national park in Sumapaz, which was, quote, of the greatest importance since the water supply to the capital depends in part on the proper conservation of the páramo. And according to these researchers, the benefits páramo lands may provide to local dwellers could never compensate the enormous prejudice campesino practices were causing to the entire country. In 1977, the national parks of Sumapaz and Chingasa were eventually established, while protected areas would be established in Guerrero in the 1990s, however, without the consent of local communities. In Sumapaz, the armed conflict prevented the effective operation of the park in a similar way to how the presence of armed groups had also limited the movement of the agrarian frontier. By contrast, the Chingasa National Park was successfully implemented through the expulsion of local peasant families and became subject to armed policing, and their lands were appropriated by the water company, which became the largest landowner of Chingasa, kind of new hacienda, possessing more than 30,000 hectares. The park forged a strategic marriage between the water company, which was constructing the massive Chingasa water management system on those acquired lands, and the National Park Agency, which was in charge of conserving the water sources that fed the company's tunnels and dams. Historian Claudia Leal highlights how this marriage rested on an initial contradiction, as the infrastructure works brought hundreds of workers equipped with large machinery and dynamite into the páramos, which the park was tasked to protect against damaging campesino practices. Now, similar to peasantization, this, what we label ecosystemization of the páramo, sought to simplify a complex landscape into a controllable structure. And the simplification was enacted through the gradual integration of the páramos into the city's water infrastructure and into the national system of protected areas. It involved a process of forced depeasantization through policing, elimination, and delegitimization of campesino practices. And in that way, the páramo as an advancing agrarian frontier was replaced by the enclosure of the páramo, a trend that culminates most recently in the delimitation of the páramo, a policy that reduces conservation to the imposition of an altitudinal limit beyond which human intervention becomes illegal. The result of this second trajectory is expressed in a slow paramisation of the landscape, or paramization, which is an ecological term or biological term that describes the patchy extension of paramo vegetation to lower levels. So the paramo starts to colonize lower parts of the mountain and thereby blurs established paramo categories. Just as potrero colonization upward the mountain was fueled by the disciplining and exploitation of campesino practices, paramo colonization downward the mountain is enabled by the banning of these very same practices. Now, bringing these two trajectories together, what we observe are overlapping, increasingly contradictory trajectories that seek to reorganize paramo landscapes in function of these hegemonic projects and thereby inevitably redefine campesino practices within those schemes, either as underperforming agrarian productivity that needs to be modernized, or as causing environmental degradation that needs to be banned. Both paramo as agrarian frontier and as a water factory foreclose the coexistence of other versions of paramo that may obstruct its newly ascribed role, making it increasingly more difficult for campesinos to continue to put paramo in practice as their home. Now, while attempted reorganizations of the paramo effectively undermined local ecologies, interrelations, and knowledges, they also triggered campesino and non-human responses that have kept the incorporation of the paramo incomplete. We could understand this response as a multi-species negotiation through which campesinos, trees, fire, cattle, frailejones have facilitated, in other times resisted, and at other times redirected the emergence of the paramo as an agrarian frontier or as a water factory, always to a certain extent. As a result of these local dynamics, the paramo landscapes in Sumapaz, Chingasa, and Guerrero have transformed in quite different ways. We could say that Guerrero presents the most intensively peasantized paramo, one of the most productive paramos that eventually became redefined as one of the most intervened paramos, to such extent even that its very existence as paramo becomes questioned. How much can a paramo transform before it ceases to be paramo? In stark contrast, Chingasa presents a paramo where a process of peasantization was ended very abruptly in the 1970s. However, even this model national park appears to be unable to exert an absolute control over this landscape. The presence of chusque plants still point to historical fire practices, while retamo plants, which were deliberately introduced in the early 20th century, have become invasive and have become labeled as a major conservation threat. Within the protected area, we also see cattle roaming freely. And this has to do with the effects of the abandonment and displacement that was deliberately instigated in Chingasa, and that have left local livestock farmers with limited workforce, which forces them to start working together and managing their cattle collectively in a system called compartidas, in which they leave their cows alone up in the paramo, and in that way continue to exert a form of property over those lands. In Sumapaz, then, the political violence and related migrations interfered with the movement of the agrarian frontier, as well as with the attempted enclosure of the paramo as a park. In a context of stigmatization, campesinos have adopted autonomous environmental decisions and have developed the proposal of a peasant reserve zone, the Zona de Reserva Campesina, which is a legally existing conservation figure in Colombia, but still continues to defy conventional notions of conservation. Now, to conclude, the transformation of the paramo into a landscape of potato monoculture and burned pasture land is usually presented as a conquest of a passive landscape, while paramo's infrastructuring as a water factory is presented, as we saw in the video, as a nature that does not need humans. By adopting a more than human or a multi-species perspective, we are tracing the co-constitution of human and non-human lives and attempt to bridge the mutual blind spot between the study of peasant societies and the study of paramo ecosystems. And it unveils landscapes as historical actors rather than the passive background of peasant trajectories, and exposes peasant practices as constitutive rather than an anomaly to páramo conservation. In exploring landscape simplifications and their unexpected effects, we aim to contribute to a plural and non-linear history writing of these páramo peasant entanglements, histories that challenge the imposition of a singular form of legitimate conservation and hence of a single legitimate future of the páramos. In that sense, páramo, understood as a patchy Anthropocene landscape, that is, a landscape in which multi-species dynamics exceed the capacities of human design to create a stable and predictable nature, invites us to co-write history in new ways, attending to artificially fluctuating páramo limits, to wandering cows, and to campesino ecological knowledge, and how it is being, amongst many other ways, how it's being transmitted through songs, video, and theater. And I want to close by referring to a recent and very concrete attempt at such collaborative endeavor. In November, we organized together with a very large group of local partners and local communities, a virtual campesino festival of páramo art with musicians, poets, and theater groups of Sumapaz and Chingasa. And I leave here the poster that reflects a different view of páramo landscape, a bit contrasting with the video we started with, and some of the songs and how they reflect on this entanglement between páramo, water, and people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hanne and Anna and Santiago. This is a fascinating story on the conflicting land uses and the complex history of human intervention in these mountainous areas. I will now pass the floor to Paula Ungar, who is a biologist, also from the Instituto Humboldt, and who has worked and is working for years now on exactly these environmental conflicts, which you see everywhere, these conflicting uses and these conflicts between the peasants, the water factories, the haciendas, the large cattle holders, and the needs of conservation, biodiversity, and water resources. Paula, I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Tim. How much time do I have so that I don't remember.
5 or 10 minutes.
I won't talk much anyway. Thank you, Hanne, Santiago, and Dana. It's wonderful to listen to these stories, which we have been talking about at different moments in our work. You start with the question about what is páramo, and that's also a question that I've been trying to answer for the last 10 years probably. And I think you illustrated very well how there is no simple answer to that question, and probably there is no answer, and that's exactly why it makes this research subject so fascinating. And although there is no answer, and of course you give no simple answer to that initial question to what a páramo is, I feel that you approach like multiple possible answers in a very inspiring way, and also inspire new questions. So I feel that what is great about this work is that you talk about like you tackle the issue of how to account for profound social ecological differences that coincided around this thing that we have named páramos. You talk about how páramos are at the same time refugee of poor displaced campesinos, but also allies of their land claims, and they become like weapons for resistance, which is something similar but not exactly the same as refugees. But at the same time, these places became, when I say at the same time, talking to historians, it's dangerous, but páramos are also in different moments in time land to be conquered for being big landowners, and also places for the industrial production of potato, which is different to the campesino economies. And also with the video at the very beginning, how páramos are charismatic and unexplored and vulnerable objects of urban worries. which is not so distant from another thing that páramos also became, which are objects of political populism. In Colombia, parties from the left to the right have used páramos in their discourses, and partly the policies that then translated into strict conservation that Hanne and the others talk about came from like a national discourse about preservation that is also embedded in political tensions at the national scale. So that's another way to answer the question about páramos. And I think you also inspire even more questions about the non-humans in páramos, or the non-humans that make up páramos. I think it's a big challenge still to how to account for these profound differences among non-humans in páramos. You tell these stories based on 3 páramos that are around Bogotá. In Colombia, there are 36 different páramo complexes that are all along the 3 Andean cordilleras that cross the country from the south to the north. So there's a huge diversity, not only in social histories or environmental histories, but also in the biology of these páramos, in the evolutionary history of these páramos, in the species that make these páramos. So I think we still have a lot to work about, like starting with the question of who speaks for these non-humans. And I think you also already hint very interestingly into the voices of the engineers and the geographers who are talking for the water in páramos. And I think there is still like a very inspiring path to travel, trying to find out who has been speaking for the other, like the huge biodiversity, because in páramos there is, although they occupy a very tiny part of the Colombian area, the number of species, the number of endemic species, the number of, like, it's extraordinary. So even this, what I just said, of course, is a representation of a particular way of accounting for non-humans, which is my background in biology. But I think there is a lot of, you inspire a lot of interesting questions also on that side of the story. So, and also another question that came to my mind when you were talking about the potrerización, the transformation of upper mountains, is there are also other non-humans who are allies of humans, which are the introduced species that came with the colonization of páramos, no? How did these alliances between introduced pastures, between eucalyptus, between all these plants that came with the colonization of páramos, how do these entanglements work? So yeah, you answer a lot of questions and you inspire new questions. So thank you very much, and I'm sure there are many questions from the other participants. So I will leave it here.
Thank you, Paula. And indeed, some good questions to start with. I don't know if Hanne or Santiago or Anna wants to respond on them. For instance, who speaks for the non-human, and do the peasants speak for the non-human? That's a good question. And also the last points of the new species and the invasive exotic species. And how do we account for these? I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Yeah, I'll try to, and I'll also hear if Anna or Santiago, I think they also will have ideas on this. But I think, yeah, I don't think I have like a very clear or deep answer on this, because this is, as Paula indicates, this is one of the big challenges when we want to write or do these more than human histories, to understand these entanglements. And particularly, I think if we really talk about a historical or historicizing perspective, how these also constantly change. There are alliances built. So, and I think this example of the potrerización is a very good example how fire might be an ally to peasants to enable this potrerización. But then new species are introduced, but they are of course introduced to international agencies or big well, I think it was US and English firms in the first phase that brought them in, and they were actually really quite aggressively enforced on peasants. So they were not necessarily allies, but in the process they might become allies, and at some point they might become allies. They start to kind of form new relations that change historically. And I think as a historian, that's the most challenging part of understanding how those alliances constantly change, because there are effects. Potrerización really changes the landscape. So all practices of producing potatoes or whatever might be different in this newly shaped landscape than elsewhere. So I guess I'm just trying to kind of express that this is a really important challenge rather than providing any real answers. But I don't know if Santiago or Ana Maria want to respond to this.
Yeah, I think the questions were also not meant for an immediate answer, but more like for a collective reflection on these issues. But of course, I will be glad to hear if you have comments on this.
Yeah, I am thinking particularly if this question can be related with the limits of our methodology or of our methods. Because our methods in this piece in particular are mostly ethnographic and mostly work in archives, but in any way we can say that we can like make a complete environmental history of páramos, even of these páramos. So I think that we are very interested in to make an opening to a different kind of questions, even these questions that we don't have a direct answer in this moment. But I think that also is important to try another kind of methods to be capable of, I don't know, of thinking this history from another points of view and another's bodies as the bodies of these not humans that are also in the páramo and that are also producers of the páramo. And we are trying to do that also with osos, with bears, in another article, another paper, but we have also this method limitation that is also a limitation of our selves as humans, no?
Maybe also, like, it's not an answer, but maybe an opportunity is that, as Hanne explained at the beginning of the presentation, this project makes part of a bigger project, and maybe like establishing, well, it's part of what we want to do, but like interdisciplinary conversations with the other components can also like broaden the scope in which we answer these type of questions, like integrating different methodologies, not only from the social science, like ethnographic methods and also archival work, but also like having deep and like meaningful conversations with, for example, the biologist who does species modeling, for example. So it's like something we have been working on, but maybe like one way to try to answer that question would be kind of establishing these kind of fruitful dialogues with the other research components of the project.
Okay.
And I think the bear, sorry, I was just thinking Anna leaded the paper or the research on the bear, and it's the Andean bear, and I think that's a good example of that kind of experiment. But yeah, I guess another time we will have time to listen to that.
Okay, there was a question from the audience by Diana Maria Valencia Duarte.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you, team. Yeah, I have actually two questions I would like to ask Hanne or Santiago, and it would be related on how do you define páramos and how do you define peasantisation or depeasantisation? And the reason is because in my own research is related with depeasantisation in Santurban Páramo. I just realized that you talked of páramo as a landscape, but for what I understand is more like landscapes. For example, Hanne, you have talked about the frailejones, but you also talk about páramo forest, which is more like zonas de transición or bosques andinos, Andean forest. So I would ask if it wouldn't be more like landscapes, or as probably more legally understand in Colombia as complex. The other question related with depeasantisation comes down to define as well what it is a peasant, related with what Paula said, because when we talk about potato monocultures, that wouldn't be a peasant economy, but so it wouldn't be a peasantisation, it would be probably more like industrialization. And according to how you defined what's peasant and peasantry, then you also defined depeasantisation. So probably, I don't know if I'm clear with that. If you can share what are your the definitions you're working on about, yeah, páramos and depeasantisation. And thanks a lot. That was a brilliant presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll kick off, and I think Santiago and Hanne can then complement. But I think, yeah, these are great questions, but obviously very big questions, but important ones. I think páramo, I mean, what is páramo? That's a bit like Paula indicated. It's actually something that we quite deliberately have not kind of reduced to a specific definition. It's the first and the last question of our project, I would say. But it is a question that is very productive, because even in our research, we are constantly guided by what is a páramo for our sources, right? It be that a scientific report from the 1930s. It's been really, I think, very instructive for us to just trace when, in what context and in what way is the very word páramo used. And of course, it has a long history of being literally kind of copy pasted from the Iberian Peninsula to Colombia to kind of, yeah, they observe a barren mountain landscape similar to what they saw in Spain and use the same word, but then it started to live its own life and came attached to a lot of connotations of being a hostile landscape. And it's only really in the 20th century that it kind of becomes the object of really coining a specific definition, a more scientific one. And I think that's where kind of the trouble starts maybe, but also the fascinating, or it enables us to see that páramo is a lot of things. The páramo, we think about it as multiple versions of páramo. The fact that páramo exists as an agrarian frontier does not completely eliminate the coexistence that the páramo at the same time can also exist as an ecosystem, and that it at the same time can exist as a home for peasants. But I think maybe what I to be more specific in terms of this particular paper, what was really productive was to trace kind of almost like a kind of language analysis, like where does páramo pop up and how is it defined, to see that páramo first was more like an used in an adjective to kind of describe a character of a place, rather than referring to kind of an entity, to a system, like what we would say now an ecosystem. But also in ethnographic research, in conversations with peasants, we would always come in with this question, like, what is a páramo for you? And in some cases, particularly in Sumapaz, the answer would be páramo is autonomy. páramo is an autonomous territory, they wouldn't refer to any biophysical element that defines what other people would define as a páramo. So I think as páramo has become kind of an object of contestation of multiple projects, its definition has multiplied, and we are rather interested in seeing how these different definitions and their implications clash or negotiate with each other, rather than kind of boiling it down to one definition. In terms of peasantization, so here I really I think peasantization could just refer to the fact that, oh, there's peasants in the páramo. That's maybe kind of the first notion, but I'm really in this paper referring to peasantization as how it's used in rural sociology and rural history of a process of incorporation by creating peasant societies that are kind of functional to the economy. But indeed, what you point out, that there is a trend, when I describe this first trajectory of peasantization, there is a moment where in certain places this becomes an industrialization and peasants are kicked out, or there is a depeasantization. I think that's actually something that didn't come out in the first trajectory that much, that in both trajectories we see eventually a depeasantization, either as being kicked out from industrial potato production as by kicked out by conservation projects. And so depeasantization is yeah, I think is both a kind of material or physical process of migrations of different production systems, but also a symbolic one when it's delegitimized or when it just becomes a process of marginalization. So yes, it's something in this presentation. I couldn't go that much into it, but it's definitely important to kind of specify what we mean by depeasantization, and also contrast it with the very loaded term of campesino, which is not the same as peasantization as a kind of sociological term, but refers much more to an identity, or yeah. I don't know if Santiago or Hanne.
No, thank you for your question, Diana. It's very interesting. I only wanted to say that to notice that the presentation began with this crazy video of Carlos Vives talking in a very weird way, with a very weird tone of voice, presenting what páramo is. So, and I think that this video is very good for producing something that I think that is very important in the páramos in Colombia today. That today it is very difficult to say páramo in a non-ecological way, or in a no-natural way. And one of the things more interesting that we have discovered in the archive is that páramo was very different things in different moments, but also that in different moments of the recent history of Colombian páramos, to say páramo in a different way was easier than now. So we see a process, especially in the last, I don't know, in the last decades, in the last years, where páramo becomes a more rigid thing, very related with a natural version of páramo, that also is contested by a different kind of factors. But we think that today is more difficult to say páramo in a different version than the version of ecosystem services and ecological institutions. And for that reason, at the beginning of our project, for us was very important the question, making a question or making like a proposal in where we openly try to not knowing what páramo is, in order to open the possibility to see different versions of páramo in different moments.
Thank you. It's clear that the páramo is also a very powerful discourse. So it's the use of the word páramo. It's very important. Are there other questions? I see our time is almost running out. If not, I have one, if I may. It's on what precedes the story. So you showed that the complex dynamic of the historical evolution of the landscape and the society from the late 19th century onwards, from the haciendas, the peasants, the ecosystemization, etc. But is there still a link, for instance, in the peasants, the campesino use of this environment to practices which date, let's say, to the 19th century and before? So is there still a sort of very long tradition of certain human paramos interaction, which goes back even deeper in time? So does the deeper history of the paramo still has a significance for today? I was wondering.
Yeah, I think on different levels, both time-wise and spatially, I think one most important probably is of course the link between the importance of what we call today paramos for the Muisca culture, which is the indigenous culture that dominated, that controlled the area around Bogota at the time of when the Spanish arrived. They didn't call this paramos, so there's often said today that the paramos are sacred for the Muisca. It's rather the lakes and the areas around the lakes that were sacred, and because they're situated in what we call today paramos, we say the paramos are sacred. But of course, paramo is not something that existed in pre-colonial times. But so there is this very important spiritual importance of the lakes as where life originates. But then there's also, if you look more at the local level, it's interesting to see that the histories are quite different between Guerrero, Chingasa, and Sumapaz, where in Sumapaz, so there were indigenous communities that became, that were controlled by the Spanish to what became resguardos or indigenous reservation land. In Sumapaz, these resguardos kind of crumbled and disappeared more than in the other paramos. So you see a discontinuity there with new and what you see in the 19th century when there's really this intensification. It's rural, interregional rural migration. So people coming from other rural areas, usually not that far away, but sometimes from rather far away. So they come with campesino practices, but to new lands. In Chingasa, there's a stronger, and Guerrero as well, there's a stronger continuity with resguardos that are lands that are being purchased by the haciendas. So there's more continuity than in Sumapaz, I would say. I don't know if Santiago or Hanne or Paula.
So you cannot really speak of a sort of traditional environmental knowledge within the campesinos, which are really, because they are also bringing in continuously practices from elsewhere.
I think that's a very important question, because as I mentioned, these are just 3 out of 36 paramos in the country. And many of them are still inside resguardos, inside communal indigenous lands. Mm-hmm. And many paramos in the country, including one lake in Chingasa, but probably others as well, are sacred, are the places where humanity was born for indigenous communities, which are very diverse in Colombia as well. So I think a very interesting research question would be to trace indigenous practices and knowledges and values around paramos in today's campesinos. For instance, there is all I don't know, juntas de acueducto, practices for commonly caring for water and agreements about water use. And and it's a very old practice that goes for generations. And I've been wondering if that's something that comes from the indigenous inheritance or not, or how does this relation to páramos as a sacred being still persist in today's relationships of campesinos to páramos? I think there are many interesting questions when you try to broaden the time window into like before the Spanish occupation.
That's fascinating. I see that Anna also wants to reply, or
Yeah, I was gonna say that it, like, as defining páramo in this context is very hard. Also, defining traditional is something like very hard. Well, if you see, like, if you equal like traditional with indigenous like population inhabiting the páramo, I think like we don't have that much. We haven't like delved deep into this kind of information. But for instance, there is like a very intimate relationship between the campesinos and the ecosystem, and depends on the eyes of who sees this kind of and like judges this kind of relationships. They can be like traditionally or not. So for example, if a conservation practitioner sees the relationship between cows, like cattle, like livestock and campesinos, they will probably like judge it as a bad practice. But like these campesinos have had this relationship with livestock from a very, very, very long time. And for example, the type of cattle that inhabits this kind of alta montaña, like the high ecosystems, is a cattle that it's kind of adapted to this kind of ecosystems because of the hair they have, because of the low maintenance they need. And this kind of relationship, it's like a long-lasting relationship that also like involves long-lasting practices between campesinos and these ecosystems. And this also happens, for example, with bears. It's not like a harmonic relationship between, like, it's full of tensions, but also like it's a relationship in itself that is like the good sides and the bad sides, you know, like, and this kind of relationship has evolved for long periods of time. So I think this is a very interesting question because it also like push us to ask us what is traditional and like who is like the judge of these practices in like categorizing them as traditional or not. So I think it's something that we should think about that too.
Thank you. I learned a lot this afternoon, this morning, and I see on the chat that many people really appreciated the presentation and the discussion. And I will close the session here. Thanking you again, Hanne, Anna, Santiago, and Paula for applause, indeed, virtual applause. It was a great presentation and a great discussion, and I hope you can continue the research also on site, hopefully in the coming period, and publish about it. And it's a tremendously interesting case study and an important theoretical discussion also on the multi-species theory, on the interaction between different human uses of this environment and the resistance of other species and the evolution of other species in the area. So good luck with your research, keep well, and see you hopefully soon on another occasion. Goodbye.
Bye, thank you very much.